Hello everyone, I hope everyone can hear me from Brussels. It's great to have you all on our online event today. I think we could go, it's about 3 o'clock. We have both our speakers. I'm Hugh Pope, Crisis Group's Director of Communications and Outreach, reaching you from semi-confinement in Brussels. As many of you know, International Crisis Group is an independent organization dedicated to saving lives through the prevention, the mitigation, and the resolution of deadly conflict. We do this through field research in less confined times. We write the detailed analytical reports that I think many of you know and love, and then we take the recommendations to the leaders and influencers of all parties. And thank you to those of the governments involved in Libya who are on the call today. We have about 120 staff, and we work on 55 conflicts and crises around the world. So today we're joined by Claudia Gazzini. Claudia, if you'd like to turn your camera on and come forward. And we also have Nigar Göksel in Istanbul, who's with us today to talk about the Turkish perspective. And we're all in lockdown in our homes, probably like most of you, so please excuse any rough edges, adventurous children, barking dogs. We're experimenting with these virtual briefings. So just some rules of the road to start with. Claudia will make some opening remarks to give us the context in Libya, and then we'll hear the Turkish perspective from Nigar. Claudia and Nigar will be speaking on the record, and please keep your cameras turned off. I think many of you can't turn them on anyway. I'm not sure what the settings are, but we'd appreciate it if we could keep the bandwidth narrow. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking, and you can reach me by chat if you'd like me to unmute you for a question, which we will do after Nigar and Claudia have had their initial presentations. There is a flag you can raise if you'd like to ask a question. It's the 3 white dots in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, and you raise the flag, and then I can see you to bring you on. Please feel free to write questions in the chat. I'll see them there. We have about an hour. We'll end at 4 p.m. Brussels time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you do ask a question, please do state your name and affiliation so we can get that clearly. I'll be first, as I said, I'll be turning first to Claudia. And she's been our leading Libya expert since 2012, actually, which is just after the beginning of the crisis. And that was a year after Gaddafi had fallen. As you all may remember, it was followed by elections in 2012, in 2014, political crisis and rival governments emerging in the east and west of the country. In 2015, the UN came in for the peace process. By 2016, the Faiz Sarraj government was in place, leading up to the last year of rather more dramatic events, in which in April 2019, General Haftar in the east went on the offensive against the west, deepening the divide between the two parts of the country. In 2019, in November, Turkey stepped in openly, signing a maritime and security memorandum with the internationally recognized Tripoli government. By January 2020, Turkey had dozens of officers and was transferring shiploads of weapons to the western side of the country. Other countries like Egypt and the UAE and Russia were helping the eastern side in Benghazi. Peace processes have been present. In January this year, Moscow and Ankara did try to get the factions to sign the deal, but in this case, only Faiz Sarraj, the Prime Minister of the Tripoli government, did. In January, we had the Berlin conference. In February, we had 2 rounds of talks in Geneva, didn't leave very far. And unfortunately, in March, Ghassan Salameh, the UN envoy and our crisis group's former co-chair, as it happens, resigned, saying that it was all too stressful for him. and we are now in a situation that General Haftar has declared himself the sole ruler of Libya. So the two sides in Libya seem as deeply separated as ever. We're here to discuss how this is now drawing in outside powers, and at this point, I'd like to hand over to you, Claudia, to take up the story.
Thank you, Hugh, for this overview, an overview of facts that since 2012 I have been witness of and followed personally. Fortunately, General Haftar hasn't declared himself yet the sole ruler of Libya, as your remarks would insinuate it, but he has proposed himself to that position. Now, I wanted to start off by making some remarks on this last report that we published, Turkey and Libya, or rather Turkey wades into stormy waters of Libya. Because this is, the conversation that we're having today comes on the heels of the publication of that report. And I wanted to underscore that, like many of our research topics, sometimes they come from, observation on the ground, and sometimes they come from simple questions that we're being asked by policymakers. In the case of this report, it was our boss, Rob Malley, who in a conversation said, why is Turkey jumping into the Libya conflict? For an outsider, that seemed rather an unintuitive policy step on behalf of Ankara. So it was from that simple question that Nigar and I embarked on this research, which took us to meet policymakers in Ankara, took me then to Libya again, to Tripoli, and engage in conversations with the Tripoli-backed government, and also then with followers or supporters of General Haftar. Of course, as I've stated in other contexts, the Turkey's intervention is new in the sense that it's an open and public intervention. It was ratified by the Turkish parliament. But in terms of Turkey's support to Tripoli-based forces and the Tripoli-based government, this is not a new fact. They have been supporting, like other countries like Qatar, Tripoli-based forces and their allies over the years. And of course, it's in many cases, in many respects, it's a reaction to the heavy level of foreign involvement in the Libya conflict, which again is also nothing new. I must say, since the early days of the conflict, since the fall of Gaddafi, we've seen foreign powers intervene militarily to topple the regime. And since then, countries have splintered in their approach. Some have been involved militarily on the ground in Libya, starting in 2014 for mainly counterterrorism purposes. So we started seeing French forces helping Khalifa Haftar's nascent Libyan National Army forces on the ground in Benghazi, striking against what were considered Al-Qaeda affiliate groups, and then ISIS affiliated groups in Benghazi. The US also lent its support in the following years for purely sort of counterterrorism purposes. And then over the years, we also saw an increased support of Emirati direct support and the setting up of military bases and considerable military help to Haftar forces. All of this was happening at a time, 2014, 2015, when there was an attempt to reconcile Libya's rival authorities. By then, the country had split into two rival governments. And the UN approach was to try to reconcile and bring under one umbrella these rival authorities. And I must say, since 2016, since the Libyan political agreement and the installment of the Tripoli-based government, things have not succeeded. All peace processes and all various attempts to bring the two sides of Libya conflict around a table and to agree on a common path ahead have failed. We've seen various attempts to mediate on a political level. There was an attempt to pursue what was called a process based on bringing together rival members of parliament from the two sides. That failed in 2017. There was a more direct attempt to have Haftar and Prime Minister Sarraj sit around the table. This was an Abu Dhabi initiative, and that failed. And so, in many respects, the war that we've been witnessing since 2019 is also a byproduct both of the high level of foreign intervention by outside parties and their ability also to bring in foreign fighters, but also is a byproduct of this continued sort of failed political process pursued by the UN, and most recently, must say, in February this year through the Berlin conference. So there's always, I think there's an inherent tension in Libya's recent history between sort of paying lip service to the notion of wanting a political process, but at the same time disagreeing on what the political process should be and should lead to. Turkey's intervention, of course, was a gamble. Many of us that were watching this unfold in November and December, must say, I confess myself, we thought that Turkey would not go in as heavily as it did in the following months. We thought this was, or personally I thought that it was more a quick win for Turkey to secure a maritime deal, but then they wouldn't invest militarily on the ground. They did, and they are, and they have in many respects helped the military stance of the Tripoli-based government. But it's too early to tell how this will unfold. And I think what's important to remember looking ahead is that on all parties, all sides of the Libya conflict, the international backers have conveniently always said that they're just intervening to pursue a political process. I personally hear that often from Egyptian officials. I've heard that from officials in the Gulf. We've heard that from Turkish officials. But there's always the risk, and I'm sure all of you know that intervening, helping, backing just creates a constant state of escalation that creates a war with no end in sight. So I think it's important to remember that 1 year into the war, thousands of people killed in the conflict around Tripoli, the objective should remain, and it's important that in this next few months we go back to a peace process, which most probably will not be able to cannot be exactly as it was framed in the previous months in Berlin. It will have to be rethought, repackaged, perhaps with different actors involved, but that should remain the objective. Thank you, Hugh.
Thanks, Claudia. That's great. We already have some questions. Caroline, I saw your Roland, I've seen your question, but I think we'll go straight over first to Claudia. To Nigar in Istanbul. And I think that Nikolai Surkov of the Primakov Institute's question of what are the main motives for the Turkish involvement in Libya will be answered in this presentation, Nikolai, I hope. Anyway, over to you, Nigar. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Hugh. Well, as our report underlines, Libya really became for Ankara the intersection point or the epicenter of two geopolitical showdowns that really transcend Libya itself. One pits Turkey against UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt in a zero-sum game for political and strategic influence across the Middle East and North Africa. And the other is long-running hostility with Cyprus and Greece over the maritime jurisdiction areas in the Aegean and the East Mediterranean. Of course, that also ties into the Cyprus dispute and Turkey's grievances towards the EU. Our meetings in Ankara really revealed that it was the convergence of these two arenas that aligned various political and strategic circles in favor of Libya, of intervening in Libya on the Turkish side. But ironically, it was also the bundling of these two that united Turkey's adversaries, that who otherwise had problems with Turkey that were unrelated. You know, from the Aegean to the Gulf, this Turkey's intervention brought together countries that it had separate battles with, let's say. First, I'll say a few words about the geopolitical confrontation with the UAE, Saudi, Egypt axis. When we asked representatives of the political leadership in Ankara why the fall of Tripoli was such a significant threat to Ankara or to Turkey's interests more broadly, they pointed to how Turkey's commercial interests and political standing and even cultural influence had been diminished in other countries that had where the leverage of UAE and Saudi Arabia had increased. So they saw that as a distinct risk of what was going to happen in Libya. They said that Libya, just like Egypt, was going to become an enemy of Turkey if Haftar's forces were able to take Tripoli. And of course, they also pointed to the implications that this would have for Turkey's standing in other North Africa countries and in the East Mediterranean. But I must say that at the root of this showdown with UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt since President Morsi's fall is really the pet project of the ruling party, AKP, the pet project to defend the popular movements in this region against monarchies and military dictatorships, which they say, I mean, since in particular the 2011 Arab uprisings, and they say it's really a matter of time that those regimes are going to lose ground and erode. And they say the same thing for Libya. They'll say Turkey is going to have been proven to be on the right side of history. But of course, what's the time frame? They say they don't know the time frame, but eventually we're going to be on the right. But I must add that this approach doesn't have full political buy-in across the political spectrum in Turkey, and that there are critics, even within the state itself, of Ankara having gone out so much on a limb to defend communities in other countries and sort of made enemies on their behalf that has come at the expense of the interests of Turkey in various cases. So I think standing against the fall of Tripoli just to ensure that it wouldn't become a proxy of Egypt in and of itself would not have been enough to unite the political spectrum that needed to be on board for such an intervention. It was really the second showdown that tipped the balance, and that's the confrontation that Libya is tied to now over maritime boundaries in the East Med. This is really a very strong unifying issue domestically, and we have a map as well. I'm not sure it's on the screen, but there have been in our interviews in Ankara a lot of mention of how Turkey is being imprisoned on the shores of the Mediterranean by these maps, maximalist maps, they say, put forth by Greece and Cyprus, and that Turkey has no other means to push back but to make a deal with another literal state that might sort of strengthen Turkey's bargaining hand, let's say, vis-a-vis the maritime delimitations. And this is, I mean, the importance of this issue is also evident in the fact that in 2018, the Tripoli government had also asked Turkey for military support, and this was not granted until Tripoli accepted to sign an MOU about establishing a maritime boundary between Turkey and Libya. So I mean, this was really a tipping point, and it's also something, I mean, an area where the Turkish political opposition is very much on board, all except for the pro-Kurdish HDP. All political parties voted in favor in parliament for the maritime delimitation agreement, and in our meetings also with opposition figures, they underlined that this was long due. It was a step that should have been taken years ago, and I think it's also in a way mobilized support for what otherwise would have been more unpopular in the Turkish scene. Of course, the dispute, the maritime dispute, has been going on for decades with Greece and Cyprus, but a sense of urgency in Turkey to co-opt Tripoli on this file has risen due to the discovery of natural gas resources in the East Med, close to Cyprus, and the plans, in particular, the plans for a pipeline that would deliver these reserves to Europe, bypassing Turkey, which would diminish Turkey's strategic importance as a node or the node of the East-West energy corridor. You can see on the map, unfortunately I can't point to it, but the light blue specks on Turkey's southern maritime area, it's the imprisonment is encapsulated in that picture, what the Turkish authorities call imprisonment. It's very hard to explain it from this position, but I have to move on. So the maritime issue, I think, was really something that united the Turkish political constituencies. We saw at the very beginning that in January, the opinion polls showed that the Turkish public was relatively ambivalent about this military support and intervention. However, I think since January, there actually haven't been polls, and I've looked for them, maybe there have been, but I haven't found them. I think the support has risen since then. At least that's what I pick up from my conversations with previous critics. And a number of reasons. I think there are three that I might highlight. One is that the criticism to Turkey's intervention really comes most strongly and loudly from Turkey's known adversaries. And in a way, it's uniting constituents in Turkey in some patriotic defensiveness. So when it comes to sort of the bigger Western powers, in Europe, with the exception of France, but also Russia, US, you don't hear a very strong positioning against Turkey's intervention. Even behind closed doors that we also mentioned in our report, there's sort of a tacit sympathy that's expressed. Secondly, the arguments about Turkey violating the UN arms embargo really get no traction in Turkey. They fall on deaf ears because they strengthen the sentiment that Turkey is being singled out and that international norms are evoked hypocritically. Of course, the arms deliveries also to the Haftar side are mentioned, and they say that this is not an argument that you can come to Turkey with. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is the cost and benefit equation. So far, with relatively small from 100 to 1,000, but relatively small, let's say, Turkey has marked notable success. And this is attributed in the Turkish debate, at least, to Turkey's sort of advanced operations planning, enabling a joined-up naval, air, and lands and air components, but also the sort of success of Turkey-made weapons. And this feeds into a sense of pride in Turkey. And of course, the public debate is restricted as well. But these elements are used to mobilize more support for this intervention. My last note will be that, of course, there's always a risk that Turkey is punched above its weight. I think it's clear that Haftar's backers have more money at their disposal and less hard power dependencies. I think obviously time will tell only if Turkey's intervention leads to a political settlement, as Claudia mentioned. There's also a risk that it results in a never-ending war. But the argument that I hear from Turkish authorities is that it's premature to come to a verdict as of yet. And I'll leave with that.
Thank you, Nigar. That's great. And I'm sorry, some people are having trouble seeing the map. We can email it to you afterwards. Don't worry about that. We've had wonderful presentations of the view from both sides. Claudia, perhaps I could ask you first. How is this intervention playing out, and what do you think the prospects for the UN-backed peace process is? And you recently spent 6 months with the UN envoy helping out, and so can you share your insights of what actually needs to happen to end this war?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's, as Nigar just mentioned, I think it's too early to say that Turkey's intervention has completely changed the balance on the ground. We must admit that there have been Turkish military support, the inflow of Syrian fighters, pro-Turkey Syrian fighters, in the numbers of about 2,000. But most importantly, Turkey's military hardware vessels, surveillance planes have helped in the past few weeks reverse slightly the balance on the ground. Tripoli-based forces have been able to reconquer parts of the coastal area west of Tripoli. They have laid siege on a hub, which is Tarhuna, which is a Haftar-based hub, and laid offensive on a strategic military base, Wutia Air Base, southwest of Tripoli. But we take note of the fact that the front lines in Tripoli have not really changed, meaning Haftar-backed forces are really still in the outskirts of Tripoli. They still control what is the international airport in Tripoli, an unused airport, but it's a big base. And in the last 2 days, we continue to see very precise airstrikes on weapons depot and bases of armed groups affiliated with the Tripoli-based government. So we haven't seen a complete change of the balance on the ground. But yes, Haftar has suffered some setbacks compared to where they were a few months ago. But there's always a tendency, I mean, who's been a Libya watcher for many years, notices that in conversations with Libyan politicians or military leaders, there's always this idea of, we'll go to the peace process when we're in a better bargaining position, right? I've heard that so many times from the Haftar side. I've heard that, and I continue to hear that now from the backers of the Tripoli-based government. So everybody's always itching to have a slight military upper hand before actually conceding and agreeing to peace talks. And I think the risk now is that we're again in that phase. So that the Tripoli-based government, which is currently feeling very emboldened, wants to go a little bit further and just succeeding a little bit more on the battlefront before actually opening up for peace talks, even though, statements that are broadcasted on social media and on TV allude to the fact that they want to have a ceasefire, and likewise from the Haftar side. So there's always the risk of, wanting to go to the negotiating table in a position of power. And that's very, very elusive. So now where do we stand for the peace process? I mean, it's a completely bogged down, the UN-backed proposal that was agreed upon in Berlin, this international conference that took place in February, that envisaged 3 tracks, essentially. A military track, a political track, and an economic track, because let's remember, Libya is not just a war, it's not just a conflict involving military means, but it's also a lot about finances and control over resources. And unfortunately, all 3 tracks at the moment are frozen, not only because of COVID-19 and the impossibility to hold meetings and negotiate, but because from the outset they suffered setbacks. Politicians walked out of political talks that were supposed to take place in Geneva when former SRSG Ghassan Salameh was still at the helm of the mission. And economic tracks was supposed to discuss the unification of the central bank of Libya, a very contentious issue, but also that is bogged down. And the ceasefire agreement that envisaged 5 military from the Haftar side and 5 military from the Tripoli side agree on the terms for a ceasefire is also stuck in the mud. Now the risk is that without an SRSG at the helm of the UN mission, and delays in nominating a new UN representative, even if we were to reach the phase where the parties and the external backers are more inclined to accept, to reconsider, and to push forward peace talks, we don't have a UN representative that can move forward the process. At the moment, mediation is in the hands of Ghassan's deputy, Stephanie Williams, and it's difficult for her to of course, because of her heritage and the legacy of Ghassan Salameh and the peace process that was put in place by him, it's very difficult for her to completely write a new format or reconfigure what exists. And I think what Libya needs now is some reshaping of that peace process, still keeping it along those 3 tracks, because finance, military, and politics are at the center of the crisis, but perhaps bringing in different actors and different representatives that can unblock the current impasse.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm now going to, you've talked to the absence of a UN envoy. We have a former UN envoy in the audience and has a question to ask about the peacemaking process. Martin Kobler, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Great. Good to see you. Now, I submitted also these questions by mail here, by the chat. I would like to know, you see, it's for an outsider a little bit difficult to see that everybody's sitting together in Berlin and the same states, you see, after the ink is dried up, I mean, they are violating the arms embargo. Now, what would help, you see, to really to prevent it, and would naming and shaming of these particular states and also sanctioning these particular states, would this be an option? I mean, Stephanie Williams was quite outspoken on it, but would this be an international option in the Berlin process, just to name and shame these states who are violating, one day after they are sitting together in Berlin, who are violating the arms embargo? Second question is about Irini. I mean, is this, well, a kind of, I don't know, is it strong enough, or how do you consider the efficiency of Irini?
Okay. Hugh, do you want to take some questions, or should I answer that?
Go with that one, and I'll give some for Nigar next.
Okay. Well, hello, Martin. Nice to hear you. So yes, the naming and shaming component of deterrence, I would put it. When the Berlin process was conceived, and it's a process because it started in the months of late 2019, it consisted of a series of meetings of international representatives of the various countries involved in the Libya conflict, directly or indirectly, 10 countries. When the architecture of that process was put in place, the idea was that there would be consultations between these countries that don't normally talk to each other, you know, Egypt, Turkey, UAE, were around the same table, and that was already an important contribution. But the idea was also that the then SRSG would ask various parties to contribute to increasing the naming and the shaming, and the panel of experts, of course, was one vehicle to do that. And the idea was that because there are so many violations of the arms embargo that have gone practically undeterred, in the sense that there's no then sanctioning of any state, because the UN Security Council wouldn't take action. Also, there's a lot of opaqueness on the nature of the intervention of this covert support being poured into Libya and overt in the case of Turkey. There was the idea that if the panel of experts, or representatives, UN representatives, could name and shame more, that would act as a deterrent. And we haven't seen that much naming and shaming. I mean, we've seen, yes, Stephanie Williams, of course, make some statements about individual attacks and the alleged involvement of certain countries. We've seen the panel of experts leak, I guess, or share their report on the presence of Russian security contractors in Libya and their alleged recruitment also of pro-regime Syrian fighters and bringing them into Libya. All of this helps because, let's say, removing the opaqueness of the intervention and being clear on who's there and who's not there helps, not so much the international actors, because we as observers know of this. We know that 1,000 Russians have been present on the ground. The Americans think it's 3,000. But it helps Libyans. It helps Libyans deconstruct, I think, this narrative that they have of this being their fight, this being, only a war between right and wrong, depending on where you stand. And the more I think Libyans understand that they are so many outside powers directly involved, that airstrikes, that fighters are foreigners, helps them, I think, question their stance. So it helps change public opinion in Libya, and this can help push public opinion more towards accepting a peace process. Regarding Irene, I would say that Irene also was supposed to be a contribution to that process that would lead to the naming and shaming, right? Because when the idea came of having an EU mission of reforming what was UNAFOR Med and having a mission that was no longer focused on disincentivizing the flow of migrants or human trafficking across the Mediterranean, and actually repurpose it for monitoring violations of the arms embargo, the purpose was actually to give more tools to European member states to actually have a clearer idea of who's violating and how, but also to give, to feed to the panel of experts more information based on satellite reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance, and by having ships deployed off the Libyan coasts. Of course, Irene was very controversial, especially in recent weeks. We saw Turkish authorities and Tripoli-based government complain that Irene is mainly targeting Turkey and Tripoli, in the sense that with vessels off the coast of Libya, they are more inclined to block Turkish transfer of weapons. I think that's an oversimplification of the dynamics of Irene. And to tell you the truth, if we continue to see Turkish Navy vessels escorting the cargoes of weapons being brought to Libya, I doubt EU member states would want to put their vessels at risk in an actual confrontation that would lead to stopping Turkish fellow NATO member states from continuing along their journey. But it helps to have intelligence to help monitor what is actually entering and not entering, and it helps to a certain extent, we'll have to see how it plays out, deter the use of foreign jets in striking in Libya.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm going to read out some questions for Nigar. Since there's quite a number of them, I think we'll need to do that for efficiency's sake. The first set is from Farid Bousaid. The questions are, is the AKP using any rhetoric that harks back to the Ottoman period and the link with Libya in Ottoman times? The second part of Farid's question is there any coordination at all with NATO, any information sharing, for example? And the third part of that question is any coordination with Qatar? And I'm going to move down to see if I can get. Why don't you start on those while there's two more questions, so over to you, Nigar.
So on Qatar, I mean, yes, the Turkish officials that we talked about that Qatar is playing a supporting role, but they did not go into details. I'm sure Claudia has more of an idea of what that supportive role of Qatar is. But so on Qatar, yes. Is there something wrong with my voice, by the way?
Go ahead. It's a little bit scratchy, but I can just make it out.
As for the question about the Ottoman rhetoric, yes, indeed, particularly in the first days of, let's say in December and January, there were, the President Erdogan in particular talked about Turkey's historical responsibility to the people of Libya due to the Ottoman history and the Ottoman Turks, that the descendants of the Ottoman Turks that still live there. And so it was an element, to tell the truth. It's died down now, and I'm not sure that it was really. I don't think if it had resonated a lot with the Turkish public, that rhetoric probably would have continued, because the president is quite savvy about those things. But yes, it was an element in those early days. Unfortunately, I really don't know how much information sharing there is going on between Turkey and NATO allies on this issue. So I'll either have to leave that unanswered or kick the ball towards Claudia.
Very good, thank you. We also have a question from Hélène de Vienne. Do you believe that Turkey is bypassing the Tripoli authorities by fueling militias directly? And if so, which ones? I guess that's for you first, Nigar, and then Claudia, if there's anything more to say.
I mean, this is actually, again, more what I heard from Claudia, but I think that the deployment of Syrian militia or Syrian fighters was not necessarily something that all GNA officials were on board with, or everybody in Tripoli at least. I think eventually, if it supports the mission, I guess that it was received positively. But I think the controversy on them was there. Otherwise, how Turkey's, what was it, fueling militants in Tripoli, again, is unfortunately not something that Ankara officials would have admitted to us, and therefore I'm not savvy to it.
Claudia, do you have anything to add?
Yes, hi. Well, I think I wanted to add on the comment on the Ottoman as well as this last question. The comments that Turkish authorities made linking their intervention to, their Ottoman heritage and saving their fellow Libyan Ottoman heirs or heirs of the Ottoman Empire, actually in Libya backlashed a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if Turkish authorities stopped beating that drum because of the messages that they were receiving back from Libyans, where, yes, everybody knows of the Ottoman history of Libya and so on, but where Libyans themselves, even those that supporting the intervention, Turkey's intervention in Libya, really do not consider themselves from an identity point of view as heirs of the Ottoman or descendants of the Ottoman. They are Arab, Libyan, first and foremost. So whenever Erdogan was using that rhetoric, increasingly I saw GNA officials and sympathizers being very uncomfortable with that. Regarding fueling the power of the militias in Tripoli by through Turkey's support, of course there's one constant message that I received back from Tripoli is that Turkish intervention and the inflow of Syrian fighters has sort of broken a bit the power balance in Tripoli between those militias that are more closely affiliated with the interior minister, with those vis-a-vis the Libyan militias, the Tripoli militias that are most closely allied with, for example, the central bank governor, or those that are more defensive of Sarraj. So these various militias have positioned themselves differently, although they are all under the same umbrella. But it has given a new lease of life, of course, to militias in Tripoli, to armed groups, and it has, in a certain sense, delayed and hindered the process that the interior minister of the Tripoli-based government was trying to pursue, which was, gradually pushing the militias out of the scene in Libya and bringing in or turning them into real state security forces. That process has suffered hiccups because of the intervention.
And an additional question from Rami Khoury on the same topic from Beirut. And he asks, you've been talking about the militias and the what he says, reports in the media about Islamists and private gangs and smugglers and so forth. What would you say were the key elements in the Tripoli government's forces?
Well, it is a hodgepodge of various interests and various factions. We have armed groups that are non-ideological. So we have armed groups that have been the centers of power of Tripoli mainly for financial reasons, securing personal interests, securing money flow, and securing they have sort of monopoly of power in Tripoli. Then we have, of course, affiliated to them in sometimes complicated relations, more criminal armed groups, traffickers, and that were involved in fuel smuggling, human trafficking, and so on. But we also had security personnel, so members of the police, members of the army that simply over the years decided not to align with Haftar, even though Haftar was and still is, proposing himself as the, representative of the sole legitimate Libyan army. There were many former army officers that just did not want to fall under his umbrella and remained loyal to Tripoli until the very end. Even external backers were hoping that these military officials would side with Haftar, but when the war started in April 2019, we were surprised to see that these commanders actually stayed loyal to Tripoli. Now, then there's also another level, which is the more ideological groups, but it's very murky because there are some Muslim Brother sympathizers. There are armed groups that are influenced by their leaders who are Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers, but there's nobody that carries that label. So the connection is not so straightforward and rather opaque. But there is also the ideological component in the armed groups, because we saw former fighters from Benghazi, within the sphere of influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, join the war in Tripoli. We saw other similar groups from the eastern outskirts of Tripoli also join the fight. So it's a mix of these components that form Tripoli-based forces. I don't know what happened to Hugh. Hugh, are you with us?
He's muted.
Hi. Hugh, are you with us? It's over to you now, if you want to give us other questions.
Okay. Something terrible has happened to my internet, or I'm not sure if you can. I think there's a question from Henri Baki. If this goes to both of you, I think Turkey's Libya agreement was quite controversial. By linking the intervention to the agreement, have the Turks strengthened European and other opposition to their involvement in Libya? So has Turkey strengthened those countries against it? Best go to you first, Nigar.
Yes, I mean, that was sort of one of the points I was trying to make, and that if these had not been linked, for example, Greece wouldn't really have a stake in who runs Libya, or UAE wouldn't really be vested in it. Maritime issues wouldn't have come together with Greece, let's say, on those issues. So I think definitely there was a convergence between these different countries that have issues with Turkey because of the bundling together. So what became a selling point in Turkey actually became increased Turkey's challenges, let's say, on the international arena. And I mean, yeah, we see definitely some European countries in particular. I mean, France stands out, but also the European countries that have an interest in the drilling and in the pipeline from Cyprus's area to Europe. I mean, those European countries definitely have taken a stronger stance against Turkey's Libya intervention, precisely because it came as a cluster wrapped up with military support, wrapped up with maritime agreement.
I would add on to that, Hugh, if you allow me. I mean, there's a certain, let's say, duplicity or complacency, if you want, on behalf of some European member states regarding Turkish intervention, in the sense that, of course, everybody, publicly cried and said that, Turkey's intervention is yet another layer of complication of the Libya conflict. It's yet another intervention. It's yet another violation of the arms embargo. But we did take note, I did take note of the fact that there were a number of European policymakers that expressed sort of tacit sympathy because they could not accept the fact that the attack on Tripoli by Haftar-led forces and his external backers would lead to the fall of the Tripoli-based government. Remember, a government that is very backed by European member states, officially backed by the UN, and which sort of represents this idea of a possible power sharing model, right? And so the collapse of the Tripoli-based government was something that most European countries did not want to see. Did not want to see a complete sort of change of the political scene in Libya. So they themselves were not willing or able or inclined for various domestic reasons to intervene to save the Tripoli-based government. But when Ankara did, you could sense sort of a sense of relief, sort of a temporary acceptance and acquiescence towards this, and not only by European policymakers. I think we witnessed that also amongst US policymakers, because on the one hand, the US has been, supporting Haftar and giving the green light for this offensive on Tripoli. But when months went on, the conflict continued, and he wasn't winning, even in Washington, especially in the State Department, which was much more sympathetic towards the Tripoli-based government. There was a certain level of acquiescence. I wouldn't say approval or go ahead, which perhaps did take place, I don't know, but there was certainly no condemnation, and that was very noticeable.
Now, a question, I think probably mainly to you, Claudia, relating to news that it seems that, at least in some degree, Russians and Turkish actors are paying Syrians to fight each other in Libya. The question that we have specifically is from Celine Mugan. And what have you discovered as far as goes the selection of Syrian armed groups to send to Libya? Have you seen any violations of international humanitarian law? And are they signing up in any way a deal with Turkey to go and fight in Libya? And that's from Celine Morgan from Geneva Call.
Yes, as far as we can tell, and I'm basing myself on what my colleagues who cover Syria tell me and what they're able to understand from their conversations with Syrian fighters on both sides of the divide in Syria, so in pro-regime areas and in Turkish controlled areas, fighters enlist for money. Because they live and their family lives in dire economic conditions. Many of them unable to bring back a salary, and the going to fight in Libya is highly profitable for the Turkish-backed Syrian fighters. The salaries, as far as we can tell, are $2,000 a month. This is huge. This is huge. So many say that they make in a few months in Libya what they made in years of fighting in Syria. So this is a huge incentive. Now, on the point of fighters on both sides. I must say, you know, we're talking today, and the news of today is this leaked UN panel of experts report about Russia recruiting Syrian pro-Assad fighters and bringing them to Libya. They mention a figure which is very high. There's, at least in the report, in the news reports that I read, there is mention of some 2,000 fighters. I personally do not have evidence of such high numbers of Syrian pro-regime fighters being brought into Libya. We've always seen evidence of flights going from Damascus to Benghazi, and rumors were that some Syrians were also brought in. My estimate was always in the range of a few hundreds, not 2,000. And as far as I understand, that number that the UN panel of experts put in its paper, which I haven't seen, only a few reporters have, that's based on the capacity of those flights that they have monitored, so the potential capacity. So it's not necessarily the real figure of Syrian pro-regime fighters that we've seen that have actually arrived in Libya. Whereas on the Turkey side of the divide, I think with some certainty we can say that the number is around 2,000 or above in terms of Syrian fighters, pro-Turkey Syrian fighters being in Libya.
Thanks. We're coming up to the end, but maybe we could widen out the questions, because we have several questions that from different places, and relating especially to the role of Moscow and the Russian approach from Heba Saleh in Cairo and others, Kasper Winchik, for instance. Can you both have tell me? Or tell the audience where is the Russian role? How do you explain the failure of Moscow to arrange a ceasefire, and how does that play off? Perhaps we can go over to you, Nigar, to talk about this, and what is the role of NATO in all this?
There was a. Is my voice echoing? Is that echoing for me? The diplomatic initiative between Ankara and Moscow to bring the two sides together was described to us in Ankara in a couple of meetings. What the Ankara officials concluded after the failure of the Russian side to get Haftar to sign the agreement that was drawn up there was that Russia Russia didn't have the clout over Haftar sufficiently to override what they thought was pressure from UAE and Egypt to ensure that he wouldn't sign this agreement. So they thought that Russia had been trumped by the other backers of Haftar and thus had not been able to forge this agreement. That was the take of the Turkish officials. But there are also some people in Ankara, also officials actually, that had also a glimmer of doubt, element of doubt that Russia had really tried very hard, and that it may have sort of been lip service and sort of not a very convincing effort. Some even thought that the U.S. should have gotten involved and pushed Egypt and the UAE to push Haftar to sign. So in that whole mix, I think the fact that they kept pointing to the fact that Haftar would get on the phone with people that they said were based in the Gulf countries or elsewhere, and then decide, take harder line. So that's the sort of the background information that we received from Ankara. But I'll leave it to Claudia. Would you like to add more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, the more foreign actors are involved in the Libya conflict, the more you have conflicting strategic interests. Now, when Turkey and Moscow were sort of trying to carve out a ceasefire or push their respective Libyan allies to agreeing on a ceasefire, there are other external actors that have conflicting aims. And then you have a domestic constituency agency as well. So in terms of this international, sort of broader international scene, it's important to remember that, you know, a Moscow-Ankara deal was not very well seen, to say the least, by Cairo and Abu Dhabi. This idea that, you know, you could bring Haftar to a point of agreement with Turkey, with who, you know, a country with whom these Gulf and Arab capitals have tense relation, was anathema. And then you have also the US dimension as well, in the sense that having, for Washington, accepting that Moscow would be the power backer of Haftar in this deal with Turkey was also anathema, in the moment in which, you know, there's a certain group of national security advisors and officials in Washington that do not want to see Russia exert an increased influence in Libya. If at all they want it to reduce, to want to see it reduced. So there were a number of conflicting international interests that pushed against a Russia-Turkey deal. I still think that today this is an avenue worth exploring, pursuing further. There needs to be some sort of basis of international understanding, and if Moscow and Ankara, which have you know, already channels of conversation, can open that door and then bring in all the other external actors as well, that is worth pursuing, no doubt.
Well, on that note, I think we'll have to draw it to a close. We've used up our time. Thank you so much, Claudia, for joining us from Rome, and Nigar from Istanbul, and thank you all for joining us. So many of you, so many questions. We will take down the questions and answer you individually later. I'm sorry, there were at least 20 questions that I couldn't read out. So I'd just like to thank you again for joining us. It was a huge audience for us, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future. So thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Nigar.
Thank you.